All right, and we are live.
Well, thank you very much and welcome everybody to our session. My name is Jeff Nichols from Westminster College. We're in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I'm a historian, and we're going to talk about this exhibit that we created. And I'd like to ask my colleagues to introduce themselves, please. Alicia?
Hi, I'm Alicia Cunningham-Bryant. I'm an associate professor at Westminster College. I'm an Egyptologist by training, and I was the exhibit director.
Hi, I'm Eileen Chanza Torres. I'm associate professor in the English department and the chair of the Gender Studies program.
And I'm Spencer Potter, associate professor of theater at Westminster College. I play dress-ups most of the time, but I guess I can do a little history now.
Well, thank you. And again, welcome to our presentation, which I believe is, if we take a look at the exhibit that we created, which I'll share with everybody here briefly, you'll see that the exhibit is named slightly differently than this session is named. This project began when I heard rumors that our administrators had discovered something racist in an old yearbook. And of course, plenty of colleges are experiencing these circumstances. I had never thought to look into those yearbooks. I hadn't done any kind of research on Westminster itself. But when I heard this rumor, I did a quick search on Utah digital newspapers, and I quickly found a photograph, which we have included in the exhibit as it's labeled Minstrel Show 1946. And I found that almost instantly. By fortunate coincidence, as a small group of us was discussing these topics, the NCPH call for papers was being circulated. And it was, of course, as we all know, supposed to be in person in Salt Lake City. So it seemed like a promising topic to explore. As we discussed this and kind of assembled our group that took a piece of this, we eventually decided that we were going to create a public exhibit on Omeka, as we'll talk about. This was in some ways personal for me. I've taught at Westminster for 25 years. It's a place I love and I care about. So it was something that I felt invested in. To turn to some of the specific materials that I worked on, if it will let me do so. Minstrel shows, as you almost certainly know, were probably the most popular entertainment in the United States in the late 19th century, particularly post-Civil War. Utah enjoyed these, as the rest of the nation did. Utah has long been a crossroads for the overland trails, for the first transcontinental telegraph, the first transcontinental railroad. So continues to be in some ways. The city of Ogden, about 40 miles north, is where the closest town to where the railroad actually joined. So it's a place where traveling theater troupes often pass through, including minstrel troupes. The Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, who established Salt Lake City, have a really well-established theater and music tradition. The president and prophet, Brigham Young, actually directed them to build a theater, the Salt Lake Theater, which is one of the biggest and the best in the West. As is so often the case, the entertainment there was quite different than what it was expected to be. Brigham Young wanted wholesome, uplifting, respectable entertainment, but minstrel shows quickly began drawing big crowds. It's perhaps another example of the triumph of low culture over so-called high culture. Minstrelsy attracted mostly white audiences, and certainly Salt Lake City was an overwhelmingly white settled place, very small Black population. There were 3 enslaved African-Americans who were among the initial pioneer company of 147 in 1847 when they founded Great Salt Lake City. African Americans could, from the start, join the LDS Church, but they could not aspire to full membership. They were denied the priesthood, although there's some recent scholarship that's complicating this story. They could not receive certain sacred practices all the way until 1978. And in fact, slavery was legalized in the territory. The legislature legalized slavery of both Native Americans and African Americans. Was the only territory where that was true. And slavery was legal until it was abolished by Congress in all the territories in 1862. There were, however, relatively few enslaved people brought to Salt Lake. Very few African Americans lived in all of Utah. In 1870, the census counted 118 African Americans in the entire territory. And that's just 5 years before the parent institution of Westminster College. As was true of virtually every northern city, there was a great deal of de facto segregation. African Americans were residentially limited in where they were allowed to settle. Not surprisingly, it appears none of their children attended Westminster College until the middle of the 20th century, although there's more research to be done about that. Westminster, as we'll talk about here, was founded by Presbyterians, and they saw it very much as a sort of part of the mission field. They were going to change Utah, as we'll talk about. So there was a great deal of antagonism and sometimes hostile rhetoric between activist Mormons and activist non-Mormons like the Presbyterians who founded Westminster. However, white settlers shared a kind of place atop the country's racial hierarchy and a taste for blackface minstrelsy that spanned that religious divide when there weren't a whole lot of things that did span the religious divide. The professional troops kept coming to Salt Lake and elsewhere till about 1900 when they began to decline. But amateur minstrelsy continued to be very, very popular. And it was popular again across the religious divide. There were Latter-day Saint shows put on an award level or stake level. They did it, the Elks put on shows, the Shriners put on shows, public schools did it, and we'll see that elsewhere in the exhibit and elsewhere in this presentation. Westminster itself was founded in parent institution in 1875. In their rather constant fundraising among Eastern Presbyterians, they would often really emphasize how they were going to be among those who were going to save Utah from the what they saw as the malign influence of the LDS Church. One pitch for funds from 1904 described the hope of Utah is in Christianizing and Americanizing its children, close quote. So they kind of felt that the adult Mormons were a lost cause, but they could change the territory through their children, change the state. By 1911, what had been the Collegiate Institute had become Westminster College, and it was at its present site, which is in the Sugar House neighborhood, southeast part of the city. Now, like any other school, Westminster produced lots of publications, lots of yearbooks. And the yearbooks are among the most revealing things. The first Etosion, as the yearbook was called, appeared in 1918. Like any other place, probably compiled and edited mostly by student staff with some faculty supervision. And those early volumes are full of in-jokes and some student cartoons, some of which are packed with the kind of racial and ethnic humor at the expense of minoritized people that also filled the vaudeville and the minstrel show stages. At this point, I would ask Alicia, who again created this exhibit, to talk about the trigger warning that she has put upon this site, just at this point before we go further.
Okay. It's worth noting that up front in this exhibit, the opening page includes a trigger warning. The images that exist in the space and that our contributors and curators have chosen to highlight and discuss contain difficult and in some cases very violent imagery, all of which is founded in racism and white supremacy. So the images range in level of racist and white supremacist imagery, but they all do contain some. So it's worth noting that the structure of this exhibit is text heavy with small galleries of thumbnails at the bottom. And should you choose to engage with them, you can click on individual images to see the full scale and read additional information. Captions are included for each thumbnail in order to contextualize the image before you see it.
Thank you. And just to take a look at this page here, which we've called Confronting Our Racist Past, some of the specific things. Again, there were a number of cartoons, and the cartoons are perhaps the most disturbing. There's a very violent cartoon that closes the 1923 Atosion. It's a cartoon about lynching. And to provide some context, there's a recent scholar that has documented at least 6 lynchings in that same year, 1923, 5 of them of African Americans. There were, over the years, a handful of lynchings in Utah itself, the most recent, I believe, being in the 1920s. The photograph that, pardon?
Can you close the tab that says virtual attendee training, one new message?
We'll see.
It's in the background at the top far right.
Yeah. Change that.
There's a request from an audience member.
Okay. There were references, passing references in 1931 and 1934 to minstrel shows. There were no photographs. In 1946, there was a, quote, old-fashioned minstrel show put on by female students. In blackface, 2 photos of that event appeared in the Atosion. One of them was also reproduced in a local newspaper. And the interlocutor for that event was the Reverend M.S. Hostetler, who taught Bible studies at Westminster for a number of years. He's featured in the photograph. He's not in blackface, but he's in a tuxedo. And it's quite likely that they relied on one of the many manuals that were available that included jokes and songs and how to put on your own minstrel show. One of my working assumptions as I looked at this material was that white people at Westminster felt comfortable doing this because there was a seemingly near total absence of Black people on campus. However, by coincidence, in 1946, that same year of that minstrel show, the student body included another minister, the Reverend Jerry Ford, who was an African Methodist Episcopal minister already ordained, who, as far as I can tell, may have been the first African-American student in the college's history. Again, more research necessary. Halloween was an occasion of blackface quite frequently. Freshman orientation was an occasion for blackface. The most recent pieces I saw, the most recent photograph of blackface in the Westminster Yearbook was 1963. In 1969, there is a photograph of a, quote, traditional slave auction. And Spencer Potter will talk about that elsewhere. So these campus materials, these publications offer some hints of the historical attitudes about race shared by too many white people at Westminster. And we hope that they serve as a sort of foundation and an incentive as we go forward to do anti-racist work at Westminster College. Spencer, please.
Thanks, Jeff. So just some of the context about my involvement. So I'm a professor of theater. I teach costume design, and I'm teaching here at Westminster. So my involvement with this project began midsummer with one of my favorite pastimes, trolling my alma mater on social media. Dixie State University. I was a undergrad graduate of 2007. Well, not 2007, in class 2007 to 2011. And this summer, as we saw national and international cries for justice and racial justice and against police violence, Dixie Chicks changed their name, right? And so I went back to trolling Dixie State and said, hey, Dixie State, if the chicks can do it, so can you. And they took the bait. They started replying to me as an organization, and I started saying, okay, well then how about these yearbook images? During one of the cycles of name change debates that have happened several times that I'll hit into, some campus community members had developed a kind of alternate Dixie State social media page, St. George University, where they had compiled a large amount of these really overtly racist images. So I just started piling those on. What about this? What about this? So Jeff contacted me and said, hey, do you want to be part of this project? And of course, is happy to join and happy to have my internet trolling habits funneled into a more productive activity, right? So that's how I, got involved. So, and as far as, I've grown up in Utah, former Mormon, me and my gay Black boyfriend really didn't fit in. So not really in the scene, but it's just been interesting to watch this because as far as I've known as a college student, Westminster's always been the progressive liberal school up north, and Dixie State was just kind of in the mix of the rest of the state schools, except for the fact, Dixie, and we'll hit into that name a little bit later. So interesting just to see on this spectrum that, every school probably has these artifacts somewhere in their archive. And as Jeff dug further, found more stuff that really didn't separate Dixie and Westminster very much. Like there was more overlap than not as far as how long these activities of slave auctions and minstrelsy were happening. So I think humbling to see that, at this institution where I currently teach, where we're generally pretty proud of how progressive we are, that the history's not that different from other schools that have chosen more overtly racist identities. And it's not as distant as we'd like to hope, too. And so my involvement with kind of thinking about Dixie historically started when I was a student in 2007. It was the first kind of rumblings of a name change for the institution. The University of Utah was considering merging with then Dixie State College, and the University of Utah had explicitly said, if you merge with us and become part of a system, you need to drop Dixie. We don't want to be associated with the racist connotations of the Confederate South. I remember that happening. And then by spring semester, then college president Lee Caldwell suddenly resigned and wasn't quite sure why, but I remember faculty coming to campus with black bands on their arms. And the general understanding was that President Caldwell was ousted by the trustees for trying to advocate for a name change. So, that's, as far as kind of living history, that's what I picked up on. So as a college freshman picking up on, oh, if you challenge the name, this is what can happen to you. And then subsequently a name change in 2012 when the college was going from seeking university status and watching how especially student body government leaders were treated at that time by administration. These were students that I was not in class with, but students that I knew as I'd gone on to grad school. So seeing those, the treatment of those students when they started to challenge the name. And then more recently, Dixie finally entered into, over the summer, an honest to goodness effort to change their name. So we'd already been working on our project for a while, and then the news in September comes that Dixie State was going to consider an actual name change. So, and that's been playing out in real time. Some of the latest updates just coming as recently as yesterday about how they're going to handle this. So I've been watching this play out for over a decade now. So again, kind of turning my trolling tendencies and then I guess a amateur historian tendency now to this project. So that's how I got here, and some wider context for my sections of the exhibit that I wanted to cover that were, they're outliers, but they're an important part of the story. And, but they didn't just quite, trying to keep the focus of the exhibit didn't quite fit in, but I wanted to kind of provide this meta context, right? And starting off with Dixie's Southern identity crisis. These are my observations, again, from spending a lot of time down there and picking up on kind of the oral histories of the locals there. And especially at that time when I got to campus, 2007, it was a very small, dusty town still. It's nowhere near the size it was that it is today. And there was very much an aversion to outsiders. The region became a retirement and resort community. So the locals definitely resented, people coming down seasonally. There was a lot of, I wouldn't say tension, but there was definitely an in-group and an out-group there based on who was originally from St. George. And that's where I came across a lot of these stories, right? Starting off with just how often longtime residents repeated stories about how harshly they had been treated by the northern part of the state. St. George, there's various origin stories for the name, named after George Albert Smith, maybe, I can't remember. Right, Jeff's got me. Jeff's the legit historian here. George Albert Smith, but some records show that George Albert Smith it was named after George because he told them to eat potatoes because potatoes had vitamin C and they were dealing with scurvy. Other stories that I heard going to school there was that George Smith sent down a critical supply wagon. So the folks were down there starving. They were sent down there to colonize by Brigham Young, had been cut off and left to die in the desert, they felt. And George sent them relief. So that's another reason for the St. George name. But then also picking up on, again, I can't find historical record, but this was part of what people even in 2007 were talking about was Brigham Young's multiple wives coming down to Brigham Young's home, one of the bigger, nicer homes in the region, while the rest of them were dealing with, more rustic homes and situations. But Brigham Young's wives coming down in all their finery and telling the local women of St. George that, well, if you were more obedient to God, you'd be blessed with better things. So again, even though it's their church leader, there's this feeling of being cut off, being punished by the North there. And then as the state develops, St. George still, from what I understand, is one of the largest cities in the country without rail service. So the railroad stops at Cedar City. So cut off from any easy supply chain there. If they want to get to railroad access, they've got to travel about 50 miles north to get to a rail pike. So they're really cut off. And so they do start to become this group of Southerners aggrieved against the North. And I think we start to really see that come into play in the section here about Whistling Dixie, the beginnings of Dixie State University. The forward page from the 1916 yearbook, when Dixie State, when Dixie Normal College is established, and the first time Dixie is used. Well, wait. Dixie Academy, and then it was Dixie College, Dixie Normal College. So the second iteration of the name, Dixie being used in the name, talks about no longer having to send resources north, and that will be a point of pride for our community. And you start to pick up on that. And then this 1916 yearbook is where we see one of the earliest examples. There's a 1913 yearbook that I haven't been able to track down that I'm aware of, but this 1916 yearbook has a racist caricature of a young girl bursting through the page and saying, I'm sure for Dixie, right? So that's the beginning hint that, okay, there's this group of people feel aggrieved by the North, and then with this, the name Dixie wasn't just associated with the fact that they were trying to grow cotton down there, but that they are maybe latching on to this idea that they are more like the United States Dixie and not just Utah's Dixie. I guess I should have explained that too. The whole reason they're latched onto Dixie is Brigham Young sent colonizers down to grow cotton. And so cotton, Dixie, the South, that's all where it comes from. It was seldom used in official records. The Annals of the Southern Mission was the official record that Brigham Young charged to be created. Hardly used. So Dixie really enters into local use in the 1915s. And interesting to note that anytime Dixie has this balloon of Southern identity, it's influenced by popular culture. So in 1915, Birth of a Nation did end up screening in Southern Utah at the Electric Theater in St. George in 1918. So, it's hard to, you can't draw the direct line, but the wider national context is knowing that Birth of a Nation's released 1915, there's the Klan's first revival, and then in St. George, Utah, there's this budding identity of Southernness, of Dixiness, right? And then things are kind of quiet until the 1950s. So after Gone with the Wind is released, and the newspapers, the local newspaper articles show a lot of excitement about that, right? People scrambling to get the book because it wasn't going to show at the local theaters for a long time. People driving hundreds of miles north to go see the film in Provo. So the generation that grew up with that by the 1950s and 60s especially start to control the college culture. And then they lean in heavy to the Confederate identity. They become the rebels. They adopt a Confederate soldier as their mascot. And then by 1969, having Terra-themed senior cotillion dances. And through this period, we start to see minstrel shows continuing, mock slave auctions in blackface that Jeff mentioned, that these were fundraisers where you would auction off slaves to go do menial work, to go do your yard work, to clean your house. And those lasted in St. George well into the 90s. The record in the Dixie State Yearbook, I think, is 1991, that the last one is recorded there, but in the wider community up until 1999, they were doing mock slave auctions. So yeah, leaning into that as far as this Southern identity. So this picking up a Southern culture. And there's a newspaper article from the student newspaper talking about the South was the most fun-loving and colorful region of the country. Why shouldn't we become more Southern in 1951? So from there, they just grow and grow and grow and really just saturate themselves in this Confederate identity. So the current state of things, I mentioned that Dixie State in the summer of 2020, the faculty senate had an emergency meeting to vote in favor of a resolution for university name change. That worked its way through the system. Their trustees approved it, and it went to the state legislature. And for a lot of folks, it seemed too good to be true, right? Like this had been something that the community had been fighting for on in 2 different periods before this. And then the college finally took its own initiative to change the name. The legislative process seemed to be running smoothly until it got to the Utah Senate, where the bill stalled out. Email records show that Senator Donaldson of St. George, Utah, in a January 21 email before the general session started, had said that the Senate wouldn't hear the bill. So it stalled, students rallied. They were eventually able to get that bill through the Senate and then onto the governor's desk, but it was a highly watered down bill. Ipsen was sure to earmark $500,000 to go towards the creation of a heritage committee that would preserve the heritage and culture of the region. And just yesterday, the list of those who are serving on that committee was released. It's hard to tell how that might play out. I mean, it's still a large number of longtime community members, stalwarts for the Dixie name. Don Ipsen's son is conveniently on this committee. So as well as Randy Wilkinson, he's listed as a community member, but he's the development officer with Dixie University, and the Dixie College Foundation president. So this foundation that's associated with the university, but really has a lot of money behind it there. So it's hard to see how that will shake out. There's only, of the 18 members listed, there are 2 BIPOC individuals. The highest ranking individual is Sean Newell, Utah System of Higher Education Vice President. And then Devin Osborne is the DSU Student Athletic Association President, a BIPOC individual as well. But the rest of it is local business people, longtime residents. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. A funny little crossover between Westminster and Dixie State, and North versus South, and outsiders and insiders. Former St. George Mayor John Pike, who recently vacated his seat to serve in the Governor Cox's cabinet, is a Westminster alum. And when John Pike was advocating for the name change of Dixie Regional Medical Center, John Pike was an executive with Intermountain Healthcare. He was labeled loudly and vocally in Facebook comment threads and editorials as a carpetbagger. So we are still in Southern Utah using carpetbagger as a term to describe an outsider who's coming down to change their way of life. As Alicia aptly titled that section about the name change, the past is present, it's fascinating to see this play out. It's fascinating to see how, in response to this Southern identity crisis, folks in the community are kind of leaning into their own lost cause ideology. It's our history. Well, your pioneers, ancestors, use this name very, very sparsely. It's hardly used during the pioneer era in St. George, and it really comes into play in the 1915s. As the area starts to grow, they start to use Dixie more and more. So this lost cause seems even more lost than maybe the United States Dixie's lost cause. It's a delusion. This community picked up this identity, played with it without much consequence. As Jeff mentioned, it was largely probably due to the fact that there's not a lot of BIPOC individuals there. So there was no consequence. You didn't see who these actions hurt. And you could just exist in this little corner of the desert and play Civil War dress up for a couple decades before someone decided to point out, hey, it's a little not accurate, but also very racist. So that's some of the wider context. Again, the images about The origins of Dixie State University are in the exhibit. The rise of Confederate and white supremacist imagery as university identity are a section, and then a large section on the past is present, chronicling the name change, debate, and struggle since 2007. I probably went over time. I'm sorry about that, Eileen, but I will pass it off to Eileen.
Thank you. I'll be brief. So I'm not a Utahn. I'm from the Caribbean. I'm from Puerto Rico, to be specific. They grew up in New York, so that's the accent. So when I arrived at Westminster College, I did so through a special program to increase diversity amongst the faculty members at Westminster College. And arriving at Westminster College, even though I'm pretty vanilla and pretty boring, I quickly became, or I think I got quickly labeled as a radical, which still shocks me that anyone thinks I'm a radical, but that's where we're at. And that has a little bit to do with how my involvement with Be a Human emerged. So some of these students, the work that these students did, this is an art collective. Some of the work the students did, they didn't do this for a class for me. Some of these students did not take any classes with me. This is actually work that they decided to do on their own, reacting to what was happening not only on our campus, but also in the nation and globally. So, you know, this started in 2016, and I supported a group of extraordinary students that launched the art collective Be a Human. 5 years later, I'm still impressed about the work they did, and also the insanity of supporting them during this intensive labor. You know, they will end at midnight and then go get really disgusting burritos with a lot of onions in it. You know, after you hit 40, anything after midnight is a nightmare, especially onions. But I went along with these students, and you know, the three installations that we see here in the collection happened over the spring semester. And I was, you know, the reason why I became involved, one was because one of my research assistants was, well, two of my research assistants were part of this group. But their argument for creating and fighting for habitable spaces on a predominantly white institution, of course, attracted me as a Puerto Rican, as a light-skinned Puerto Rican, as a woman of color, as a person of African descent. My work in the classroom and on campus in general has a lot to do with diversity, whether or not I want it to, right? And so the appeal that these students, that this project had, and the way that I got lulled into helping them, had a lot to do with the fact that these students also experience marginalization on campus, right? This is a group of students of BIPOC, LGBTQ plus students who wanted to fight back and wanted a recognition of that they were there, that they were invited there, as they were also not just only invited, but you know, I'm struggling with the word. I don't want to say used, but for certainly they were also promoted, right? Like, here, look at our diversity. And I think these students as consumers, right? And we need to face the fact that colleges and universities, the business model that we work under, for sure use, you know, places our students as consumers. And they were, let me actually read their statement, because I think they say it best, right? Our goal was to educate ourselves and our campus community on racism, ableism, transphobia, and queerphobia. We're pissed off because, we're pissed off because shit that contradicts what it means to be educated, kind, and socially aware keeps happening on our campus. The three installations we put together were a means to combat the violent speech acts that go unrecognized in the classroom, in the dorms, in the bathrooms, in the commons, and on social media. The first two installations were held in the classroom as a means to fill spaces that often go unchecked with white supremacy. Students and professors who used these classrooms were forced to engage with images that demanded a recognition of privilege, the privilege to study here, to teach here, and to disrupt this space. And so this is the statement that you'll see on one of the images on the collection. And so the act, or this goal to disrupt the spaces, and it did disrupt the space, by the way. It really did, shook some of the faculty, staff, and administrators on campus at the time. These installations were just briefly up for a couple of weeks, and then taken down. But in the act of occupying spaces not intended or made for Black, Brown, Indigenous, queer, trans, or people with disabilities, they were actively rejecting what Sarah Ahmed in queer phenomenology refers to as white lines of inheritance. Now, for some of these students were not all BIPOCs, right? So for sure, the way in which they were marginalized becomes much more complicated than race, right? But it's still based on misogyny, it's still based on the other. And so this active rejection, right, may seem, easy because that inheritance was never theirs, right? So as someone who also, this space was not made for me, right? As a Puerto Rican, as, working class, first generation, first generation that made it past grade school, for sure an institution like Westminster College was not made for me. Most colleges were not made for me. None of them were made for me. So for some of us, this rejection of the inheritance, this white lines of inheritance, and by that, what Ahmed means is that, these spaces were made for specific people who have privilege, and therefore they can access the space. The space is theirs, they inherited the space, right? And for the rest of us, we didn't inherit the space is not ours, right? And so for students to reject this, for me to join in with them, to support them, and I'm not taking ownership of any of this, is a lot, the work that was done here was done in a very way of sharing knowledge, right? Of course, I have a PhD. Of course, I had some background that these students did not have, but they too taught me things, right? Like they too opened my eyes up to certain things that which I was not being actively inclusive in my own pedagogy and in my own research. But I want to go back to like what this act of rejection actually means. And so for Ahmed, she argues that if you arrive at an institution that is not built for you, then you encounter the fit as tight, as a restriction. And then she goes on to compare this to like a dress, right? Specifically if by restriction, she means that institutions are like an old garment. He has acquired the shape of those who tend to wear it, such that it is easier to wear it if you have that shape. And so if you don't have that shape, then it becomes corrosive, right? And what we see here in this moment in 2016, in light of what was happening with Trump, right? In light of what was happening with Black Lives Matter, in this, renewed commitment to paying attention to the overt murder of Indigenous women, overt murder of trans women, what we see here is an eruption, a moment of this doesn't fit, and it finally overflows and explodes, right? And in this moment, we capture it in these pictures, and these students actually captured it in these pictures. And so my goal was to frame these images around this act of rejection. What does it mean to reject this inheritance? Again, an inheritance that for many of us, it was not ours to have in the first place, right? And, again, in light of how institutions invite diversity, and then that invitation comes with a consumption, right? That invitation comes with now you serve to demonstrate that we have moved beyond this history, which by the way, we're not going to tell you, we're going to hide somewhere, or at least not hide, but let's not promote it too much. And so this disruption here, at least I see as an act of rejection, right? And these students stood, you know, with each other and learn more about each other as a means to do that rejection. Now, I'm just going to quickly show some images. I know we're running short on time, and I want to give my colleague time to explain the exhibit, which is really important. And so, okay, so some of the images, this is the logo that they had. I love that they picked the idea of being a human. I'm a humanist, of course, I found that really attractive. But the idea of placing this logo everywhere and utilizing a very, you know, Black-centered image of the fist up was extremely important. They got a lot of flack for using cuss words, which they had to kind of play with a little bit. But this is the final exhibit where they brought in everything that they had placed in different rooms. And so part of the exhibit was an engagement with how their bodies fit in the space. And a lot of these models, which were made out of packing tape, lots and lots of packing tape, where the students themselves, like, making copies of their bodies and rearranging them and rethinking about the way in which they fit in relationship to the history of, say, racism in a state like Utah, or the history of ableism and specifically eugenics in this state, right? And so one of my favorite images that they did is actually a close-up of a poster, and it contained excerpts from the novel by Ixta Maya Murray's Locas, and alongside of it, it put quotes, it integrated quotes between that and Trump. And so what they did, they actually highlighted some of the areas that they wanted to, like the person that just walked by, to quickly see to read, right? And so this is one of course, Trump's, former President Trump's, you know, speeches about him not being a racist. And so what they highlight ends up reading, "I apologize for the truth, I am a racist." And so these were the ways in which the students were both playing with language, playing with how their bodies fit in. Here's a close-up of them putting up some of the images up on Converse. There's a detail of the first one where they're here as part of the Black Lives Matter. This was a reaction to the silencing of Black women, specifically trans Black women. And so the work that they were doing was, like, again, imposing their bodies, imposing their words, imposing language on the walls, again, if only momentarily, to say, this space is not mine. And I'll say something really quick about the tape. The tape you see there, I didn't really ask too many questions about stuff that they were putting up. Turns out to be Gorilla Tape, and Gorilla Tape does not come off. And so one of the things that I find really fascinating is that they damage the walls. And one of the things that Ahmed says about walking away from these white lines of inheritance is that you do have to damage the product. The product has to be damaged because the product itself is toxic. And so most of the time, for those of us who are, you know, the unwanted, the othered in these spaces, all we do is scratch, right? Make just minor scratches. And so here are some minor scratches that were quickly fixed. And I'll end a picture with these wonderful human beings who were the coordinators of Be a Human, Ryan LaRae, who is off to, I think, Michigan state law. That's Maria Vázquez Gordo, who's actually working at the University of Utah Hospital. And that's the last one there is Emerson Barrett, who is finishing up a master's degree in women's studies. But anyway, I'll leave that and then pass it over to Alicia. Thank you for being so patient.
Thanks so much, Eileen. I love those photos, and I love the. I think that's an incredibly powerful point you make about the gorilla tape and how it actually ties to Ahmed's claim and goal. I think that's deeply moving and powerful. I'm Alicia Cunningham-Bryant. I had the privilege of working with each of these collaborators to come up with a way to address some of the issues that we saw at play here in a digital space, and highlight some of these structures and issues and bring them to light. As Jeff mentioned at the very beginning, the concept for this panel and this exhibit came from knowledge, associated knowledge around Westminster yearbooks. And this was sort of part of what's been called the Great Yearbook Awakening that began in circa 2015 through 2019 and really took off in 2019 and led to conversations surrounding the fundamental white supremacist narratives found in yearbooks in the United States. And it asked all of us at our institutions to engage with our past and with our history. Spencer pointed out that Westminster, and Eileen did as well, has claimed to be a very progressive institution, and yet is a predominantly white institution in a predominantly white state, and reinforces a lot of these white supremacist narratives on a day-to-day basis. So the goal of this exhibit was to begin anti-racist work at our institution, to force our faculty members, our community members, our alums to engage with that history at our institution, and to look at how this has functioned, not just at Westminster, but also at Dixie, as part of this broader Utah narrative of white supremacy in higher education. So you've seen some of the exhibit already, and I won't dwell too much on it particularly, but we have broken it up based off of the constructions and the questions and the narratives that each of the contributors bring to the conversation, looking at the sort of history of slavery and minstrelsy here in Utah, specifically at Westminster, followed by the creation of the idea and concepts behind Dixie identity in Southern Utah and how that mapped onto Dixie State and the current conversations surrounding name change and how that has been a fraught process in Southern Utah, but is finally a visible conversation for the first time. And Westminster, for us, this is really the first time we're having a visible conversation about these issues. That's sort of what this is meant to get started. And then leading to Eileen's contribution in her students' work on Be a Human that highlights that this is an issue that students are experiencing, that they led the way on, and yet it was a one-off in 2016. We haven't seen an expansion of that in the last 5 years. And so how do we as an institution recognize and move forward from this incredible work that the students did in 2016, grapple with the issues that underlie the experience that they had, recognize our own positionality, and then use this as a mechanism to think through anti-racist ways to move forward. All of that is to say that this exhibit has no good answers. It's not a solution. None of these stories ends beautifully. Both of them are very nebulous at best. And that's sort of the nature of the beast. It is where we're at as institutions. We don't have solutions. I mentioned it briefly when Jeff brought it up, but you'll notice that the way that I constructed this exhibit opens with a trigger warning about specifically the kinds of images that are included, followed by the structure of the pages. It's not super visually interesting. As someone who's curated a lot of exhibits, I found that difficult for myself. And I've curated a lot of exhibits across a lot of different angles and different types of exhibits. But it was a conscious choice in this case, looking at sort of constructions as mechanisms for truth telling, but also contextualizing for community members who may be unaware of the past or who have been purposefully ignorant of the past and the current situations of these institutions, as well as working from sort of trauma-informed narratives about how to prevent inadvertent harm. So all pages open with contextualizing text followed by galleries with thumbnails as mechanisms for engaging with the material, having conversations about the material, and also not causing additional problems should there be any. So that is where I think we will transition to Q&A, because I want to be respectful of everyone's time as we move forward.
Let me just also say that we do have quite a lot of folks doing a lot of anti-racist work, yes. Specifically Dr. Tam Stevenson, who heads our Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. But, you know, it's like, you know, going to the beach with a bucket, right? Like there's no way we'll be able to gather all that water. But if I may press you a little bit on the trigger warning, Alicia, can you tell us a little bit about its purpose and who is it meant for? Like how did you imagine it to work? Or how, no, sorry, not how you imagine it. What is the purpose of it? Because it's here, it's not imagined, you know.
Yeah. So the purpose of the trigger warning is to recognize that the images that are involved in sections of this exhibit are particularly, and Jeff referenced it, I believe briefly, some of the cartoons are deeply violent and depict lynchings. And in spaces where you are engaging in these conversations, the goal and the community who is engaging with it is multifaceted. And so by providing an opportunity to be upfront about what people will encounter, the goal was to mitigate inadvertent harm for those who may be confronted by those images and for which they may be traumatic. Recognizing that trauma spans numerous areas and has a double-edged sword, as we talked about before this started, about the nature of the community members who are engaging with this. As we mentioned, this is a predominantly white institution. And so by its very nature, the trigger warning is for a predominantly white audience. But also recognizing that images of lynching are by their nature violent and could be violent for BIPOC members of our community. So trying to be both empathetic to those who have been actively harmed by this white supremacist narrative in the past, while also recognizing that it does soft foot it around white individuals of privilege who could choose to opt out as a result.
Thank you. Thank you. Should I jump into another question? I actually want to know, Jeff, as a historian, what is your relationship to these images? You know, these images, of course, you know, we've had conversations about this before, but, you know, all history for me is triggering as a person of color. But what role do you play in carrying this history, not only as a historian, but if I may put you on the spot as a white man, what is this to you?
That's a great question. I think as a historian, certainly, I think that it's I believe in the inherent value of documenting and showing and talking about the past, of bringing sources from the past to light. At the same time, I certainly have questioned and wrestled with, does reproducing these images, which are, let's face it, they're not groundbreaking in any way in terms of their uniqueness, other than them being unique to Westminster. Part of it, both as a historian and as a white man, was wanting to contribute to the work that's being done locally, on campus, nationally, hopefully globally, to change the world, to make it a better place. It's a very small contribution, but it's what I know how to do.
I'll just let our attendees know that they could post questions if they want. I could keep asking questions, but I don't want to be that person.
So, I mean, I have a question for Spencer. So, and I think it sort of aligns a bit with your question for Jeff. How a lot of this and this sort of great yearbook reckoning has been about, and Dixie particularly has really focused on, what does it mean for alums? What does it mean to change these names for alums? As an alum, what is this experience of pulling this history together been like for you? And what do you think about this ultimate solution that the Utah Senate has come up with, including this heritage foundation with no historians?
Right. Yeah, we hit that. There's no historians. You know, with part of Eileen's question, what it means for me is, when I was at Dixie State, I was involved in student government. So I sang the songs and I helped perpetuate this mythology around the Dixie spirit and what Dixie really meant in that first rebranding fiasco. You know, it's like, no, it's the Dixie spirit. So I was complicit in that way. And I had, you know, I was the last class of rebels admitted. They changed the mascot that year. And for a bit, that was a point of pride. We're like, yeah, we're the last rebels. So it was just knowing better and doing better. And then with gathering the information, I mean, I knew it was there. We always knew that those yearbooks with these horribly racist images were in the student government office. People would come look at them every now and then, but we kind of ignored it. So to Jeff's point too, making sure it's public. They're not unique, but unique to that institution. And I'd be lying if I wasn't really concerned about the end result of the legislative session and the name change. You know, they are restarting the process. They basically kicked it back after the university finally had a consensus about changing its name. They kicked it back. They're starting it all over again. And then with $500,000 earmarked to this really kind of loosely assembled heritage committee without a historian, without anybody that I'm aware of that has any experience with truth and reconciliation, without anybody from Utah, the Utah Cultural Alliance. So nobody with expertise in history, culture, heritage, you know, Heritage Foundation, nothing. So I'm hoping that maybe this exhibit is a way to make sure that as much as folks want to focus on pioneer heritage, this is also the heritage. And an honest history will include this, right? This can't be forgotten, can't be overlooked. And so, yeah, I'm hoping it's a way to help spread awareness too with the alumni that I'm associated with and the faculty that I'm still associated with down there to help get people thinking about what Dixie means. Yeah, so I don't want to say redemption because again, that's not possible, but it's a fact. I participated and I need to now I know better, I need to do better, I need to help people become aware.
If I can turn to a couple of questions in the chat. Rachel Gross asks, what is the funding necessary to do campus-based history? Who supports this on your campus? We're getting a good deal of support from the top level in terms of encouragement. Our president was aware of this from the start. She's been super supportive. Dr. Tamara Stevenson was mentioned, has been very supportive. And frankly, this isn't something I've been directly part of or aware of, in the face of apparently some pushback from some, let's call them stakeholders in the Westminster community, perhaps to be expected. In terms of funding, hell, we're humanists. We're lucky to have two nickels to rub together. We did get support for buying a good Omeka account. This is, among other things, the launching of our first Omeka-based exhibit, and we got some support for that and some suggestions of others. Janica Dillon asks, how have other universities in Utah responded to your project, or any of them working on similar projects? I know BYU has been grappling with many current and past issues of racism. And I think that's a great point. I was just hearing about the BYU slavery project, as they're calling it. They became aware, or re-aware, I guess, that they have buildings on campus named for slave owners, some of the founders of that institution. This was a group that I heard discuss this, that included two retired BYU historians who talked about how pleased they were, and I think quite genuinely and sincerely, that this kind of work was being done, and as far as we can tell, being supported, suggesting that wouldn't have been true in past decades. Paul Reeve at the University of Utah has been working on, what does he call it, a century of Black Mormons, and he's also got a very good book on race and the LDS Church, which has inevitably revealed lots and lots of things that go well beyond the LDS Church, and they're building a pretty considerable database on that.
If I may, it's a little, I mean, I'm curious to see how they're going to address this, because, you know, you can't talk about racism without talking about its roots, and you can't talk about its roots without talking about just colonialism, right? So, and the role that religion has played in colonialism, and it continues to play, especially through missionary work. So I'd be curious to know, how are they going to grapple with the fact that they're still participating, and they're not the only religion, still participating in acts of colonialism by sending out missionaries to like places like Puerto Rico, right? Where they're building temples. My island doesn't need more religion, I would argue, but that's a different story. But I'd be curious to know, how do you grapple with a history that you still participate in? How do you grapple with, and this is not only for BYU, this is for all of us. How do we grapple with still using the same tools of violence, and then speak about, you know, making amends is, yeah, that's not the word, but like, how do you speak about recognizing those acts, recognizing the embedded history, recognizing that literally the walls are, you know, acts, you know, like they're acts of racism, right? Like there's no other way of seeing it. So I'd be curious to know how religious institutions can grapple with that in relationship to, especially if you're still sending out missionaries to like Black and brown spaces to convert folks, how you grapple with that. So that'd be curious. I want to know. Sorry. Did you want to read the next question, Jeff? Because I think you could answer that question.
Yeah, Janica Dillon also asks about using yearbooks as a source. And this is obviously, this stuff is really preliminary. As I think I said, the run of yearbooks begins in 1918. By that point, the institution was, 43 years old. There is certainly documentation before then that we haven't gotten into in a systemic way. I sat in the archive, the teeny tiny special collections at the Westminster College library, and went through yearbooks, realizing, I hope, the real limitations of those. They are, they're official publications, certainly. They reflect, at least, reflect in some ways the student input, and I'm assuming there was at least some vague supervision over what got published. But I think they, in some ways, it's very much the tip of the racist iceberg, if I can say that. These are the things that presumably people felt comfortable in memorializing, in remembering, in publishing, in looking back on 50, 60, 70 years later. I don't know. Probably plenty of those alums look back at their old yearbooks, and I hope they say, "Oh my God, what were we thinking?" But I don't know that. What we can't get at without other sources, and even then we can only get partway there, are the mindsets and the things that were going on, the general campus culture, the general campus atmosphere. That is probably lost forever, but the yearbooks give us at least a tiny glimpse of that.
We also, in this sort of broader discussion of yearbooks as a place to begin looking at the history of white supremacist narratives and their perpetuation on college campuses, with as I mentioned earlier, the quote unquote great yearbook reckoning. USA Today in 2019 did a review of 900 publications across 150 colleges and universities, including yearbooks for decades through the 70s and 80s. They say that it mostly topped out there. And they also interviewed a bunch of people who are named in the yearbooks next to their blackface photos, and to check in with them about, hey, what was this like for you? Do you remember this? Do you have corroborating material from it? One of the interviewees specifically pointed out that he actually had the photo. He had it in the yearbook itself that he had from that time period, and he thought it was fine at the time. It didn't occur to him that it was problematic, and even now, when confronted with it as part of this conversation, did not see the problem inherent in it. And so, as Jeff mentions, it's sort of an opening to look at broader campus climate, culture, and individual choices through these time periods that allow us then to potentially track down individuals who were actively participating in this, and to sort of then do that kind of oral history work alongside, in order to provide a bigger picture of what was happening, why was it happening, and how can we address this as a campus now, since we clearly weren't doing it then. And so this was part of a much bigger project, but it sort of gives us ways in, since you do have additional information provided in many of those images for individuals.
I have a question from Catherine Julian. What do you envision being your intervention with the exhibit, and how can colonial white supremacist institutions go beyond just recognizing history and actively support marginalized people? In other words, what does this history look like as advocacy? A hard question, especially in a college campus. I think there's just so many different, there's so many different ways in which the members of the community have to buy in and recognize that this is a necessary thing to do. One of the things that Be a Human did was they aggressively pursued a pronoun campaign where it demanded that faculty, staff, and fellow students recognize pronouns, right? That they made, and it was a successful campaign that they had, and they wouldn't let up, right? Which was great. But I participated I was a faculty member that participated in our the start of every semester, we meet and we discuss different topics that need to be discussed for the year. And, I held a workshop. Well, it wasn't a workshop. I talked about, recognizing students and faculty and staff pronouns, and the resistance was impressive. And although now we include a recognition of pronouns, that is, we stated in our syllabi that it is your right to be called the name you want to be called, and it is your right to be referred to with the pronoun that feels right for you, right? Even though that's a requirement that we put in our syllabi, very few faculty members read it on the first day of class or actually respect it. And so, and right now, I took on the gig of being the W Core director, and the buy-in for all our courses, including some kind of diversity element, has also been an interesting pushback, right? And it hasn't even been rolled out yet. It's just been a request. Hey, consider ways in which you could actually be more inclusive in your syllabi. So I don't have an answer. I'm sorry. I don't know. I don't know how. I don't know. I mean, I just by the state of being, I try to be, I try to do the work, but I don't know how many of my colleagues, with the exception of very few, as we see, are buying in, are understanding the need and the necessity for moving away from, colonialist-centered way of teaching and thinking. But I'll stop there and see what my colleagues want to say about that. Yes, thank you, Alicia. I didn't say what it was.
This, of course, has made me realize with embarrassment that I don't have my pronouns listed on my Zoom profile. So my apologies.
I think to Eileen's point and question, Eileen's points, and then part of Catherine Julian's question, is I think maybe over, even in our circles of academics and well-meaning people, to keep the history as advocacy, to keep this in people's minds that this is recent history. 1969, and maybe this is kind of where my design brain kicks in, but when people see a black and white image, it's just automatically backdated to, oh, well, that was so long ago. It's not that long ago. So again, with this being not necessarily my field of expertise, but I can really just see the value of keeping people accountable to remember this isn't the distant past. Those kind of mind melts when you would realize how old Martin Luther King Jr. would be, right? He'd be as old as Barbara Walters. Ruby Bridges just turned, what, 60, 61? So this isn't when things become historicized, it kind of gets compartmentalized and put away. This isn't put away, it's here. And I don't know how, I'm sure there's other ways for it to become more active, but I could see that maybe being one of the most valuable advocacy roles, is to keep people accountable and aware that this isn't that long ago.
But I wonder if embracing failure is part of this, right? To suggest that I do diversity or that I do inclusion perfect because I'm a woman of color is bullshit, right? Let's just be honest about that. I just finished, we hold a sex positive week annually at Westminster College, and I included no one who spoke from the experience of a person with disabilities, right? And that was a major failure. And I've done it in the past, and this time I didn't, right? And I see myself doing that in the classroom all the time. And one of the things that I strive to and I work really hard at, and it may be that I started this career late. I wasn't 20 when I went, I didn't go to college like the typical way, right? But I think embracing failure and recognizing that I need more education, that I need to know more, right? Like that's the reason why I got into this gig in the first place, was because I just wanted to live in a life of books, right? And I think part of the change has to do with walking away, as Ahmed talks about in Queer Phenomenology and a bunch of her work, walking away from those white lines of inheritance that speak to, even for those of us who are not white, we kind of do this kind of adjacent walk that really doesn't really let us in, but we buy in to an idea that we are participating, that we are one of those, but then there's moments where we recognize and realize we're not. And I've had those moments a lot in the classroom where students call me out and, they're rough when you're called out. And those moments of calling out are extremely important because, especially in an institution like Westminster College, where it's discussion-based mostly, like I don't lecture in any of my classes, that back and forth of learning from your students and, just beyond the books is so important. So I kind of wonder what role just being in a constant state of learning could do for us, especially at our institution. So anyway.
I second Eileen's constant failure and the need to highlight failure. I think that higher ed institutions love a good progress narrative more than most institutions. And highlighting and reinforcing areas of fundamental institutional failure and participation in white supremacist narratives is necessary in order to shift and actually make any change, anything for students, for faculty, in any capacity. I also, to your question, Catherine, about the exhibit as an mechanism for advocacy. Prior to this, we had a meeting with the president, Dr. Tamara Stevens, who's our chief diversity officer, and marketing and communications from our institution about what this was going to look like and what would this mean for our alums, for our trustees, for the people who invest in our institution. And we're a small liberal arts college. We're a tuition-based private institution. We're not affiliated with a religious organization, but we are dependent on our alums, our donors, our students. And I think advocacy, exhibits as advocacy, I think forcing our community, not just our student community, but our long-term invested, our financially invested community is fundamental to our ability as an institution to implement change. That changing the minds of some of our constituents and constituencies and demonstrating the need to do so is fundamentally necessary, because we have received pushback. Our institution has received pushback in those places for choices to move forward, for choices towards anti-racist work. So I think it is, we're going to do another one of these for our community members as well, in order to sort of shift that, to start the conversation, and to force start the conversation, because as Eileen points out, students are already doing it. The students have led the way on this and the need. So if we as faculty can force the conversation with alums, trustees, members who are not participating in the on-campus community on the day-to-day basis, at least one would hope that starting the conversation there will allow us to elevate those conversations the students are having and to make the changes that they need and deserve.
Absolutely. Also, I borrow that from both Bell Hooks and Jack Halberstam, The Queer Art of Failure. So great texts. Bell Hooks, fantastic, right, for pedagogical models, but also Jack Halberstam. We have another question from Catherine Julian. What do you envision being your Oh, that's the same one. Wait, I see a notice for a second one and I don't know what it is. Who sees it?
Oh, she says thank you.
Or thank you.
Never mind.
Yeah, this is a relatively new experience for me to be considering using history as advocacy, quite frankly. I have certainly been guilty, as I think probably plenty of scholars have in the past, is saying, hey, I'm going to spend my time writing these cool little stories about dead people, and you get to make of it what you will. This is quite different. This is quite different. This is using it for a purpose.
Looks like we have 5 minutes left if anyone has one last burning question.
I'll quickly just add, this was a comment that I think Jeff meant to go to our attendees too, but oral history is a valuable source in addition to your books. Maybe the best to continue this work.
For sure, at least to center, right, the experience of, thinking about like the Black feminist approach to placing that, the most vulnerable in the center and giving them the stage and the place to voice their experience. I think that oral histories are really important, but, asking how you ask those questions are also thinking about even the trigger warning, right? Like you just don't pop up to someone who's a person of color, BIPOC, and go, hey, how's racism treating you today? That would be pretty horrifying. Although people do that, it's just FYI. But for sure, right? Like there's a model. I don't collect oral histories, but there's a model that requires that you think about your subject and how you frame those questions. But yeah, that's a really great. You also placed a comment, Spencer, on that only came to us, just FYI.
Yeah, even if we don't have two Nichols to rub together, we'll always have a Jeff Nichols. Maybe I can rub his great hair. But, we can rub his great hair and get some hair.
I think maybe she was talking about your one about missionaries and extracting wealth.
Oh, well, okay, yeah, I knew that one was private.
Did a good job.
I'm sorry. No,
I could jump into that one. I'll do it quick. Just with having grown up in that church, I'm still technically on the records, so I think I can maybe. I'm an apostate member, but a member nonetheless. It's worth noting too that in these missionary efforts that are neo-colonial, that part of the requirements of a member to be in good standing is to pay 10% of their income in a tithing. It's said to be voluntary, but if you don't pay this tithing, you can't go to temple, and at temple is where you get the highest ordinances to go to the highest level of heaven. So extracting wealth, there's a wealth extraction component to it. And worth noting that during the span of the pandemic, the church had a $6 billion return on investment for its that period. And there's all sorts of news about maybe $100 billion somewhere downtown in Salt Lake City. So worth noting there too that colonizing and, well, I mean, that's colonizing, wealth extraction, right? Wealth extraction.
But of course they didn't invent it, right?
Yeah, you can do it online now. You can pay with a credit card. I mean, no.
Well, what I'm saying is just, the LDS Church for sure did not invent this concept.
No.
But we're living in Utah.
Yeah.
It's a little hard not to. Yeah.
It's all
I'm struck by this sort of overlapping imperialism and missionary work that Westminster's a part of. Here's this half-century-old community that displaced indigenous people, and here come the Presbyterians to say, no, you're doing Christianity wrong. And it certainly was part of the home mission movement, the international mission movement.
Mm-hmm.
you're the wrong kind of religious. Well, we do have one more minute. Any last questions before we thank all of you for coming and listening to us? Thank you for coming and listening to us. I appreciate it. Thank you very much to Morgan for supporting us here. And please enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you all. Thanks, Morgan.
Thanks, Morgan.